Regarding the station of Quddús, he should by no means be considered having had the station of a prophet. His station was no doubt a very exalted one, and far above that of any of the letters of the living, including the first letter, Mullah Hussein. Quddús reflected more than any of the disciples of the Bab the light of his teaching. From a letter written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi to an individual. So this week, we're really happy to have Mrs. Karen Webb, and she'll be talking about Quddus, who is the last disciple of the Bab. Karen is a longtime Bahá'í who, easing into retirement, followed a longtime dream of returning to school to study comparative religion. She's recently completed her MA in Religious Studies at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Although she considers herself more of a theologian than a historian, she chose to write a comprehensive English biography of Quddus as her thesis project, in part because our information in English on this extraordinary Bábi figure is fragmented, and because there's no one English source that tells his whole story. She and her husband are currently homefront pioneers in rural/suburban Utah, where they live with their 4 children, 1 human and 3 feline. Her next project will be continuing with a fantasy series that incorporates a lot of Bahá'í material while still being a good read. So with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Mrs. Webb.
Let me just, for those of you who can read Persian, and I hope I'm holding this right, we don't yet, I'm trying to get my thesis published, but we do not in English yet have a comprehensive bio of Quddus. This came out in 2016, Ganji Pinhan, I think is the title, Hidden Treasure, by an Iranian Baha'i called Tushmand Degan. I was lucky to find somebody who had a copy of it. This is probably the best thing that's been done yet, but again, Persian. I had kind of adventures in translation, dealing with a lot of the materials that were in Persian, trying to incorporate them into my thesis. So the information is out there. Our best source in English is probably still Dawnbreakers, but within Dawnbreakers, except for the battle at the fort of the shrine of Sheikh Tabarsi, it's somewhat fragmented, and you have to look other places for information on his backstory. So I have tried to put this together. This was a 150-page paper. I was told I had to present in about 30 minutes. So here we go. I subscribed to SlidesGo, which is a place that will give you pretty backgrounds for your talks. Let me share my screen. Here we go. So I know this is controversial right now, but they had a new option that was let the AI generate a slideshow for you. So I tried a couple of possibilities, and they actually came up with some interesting ideas, and some of the slides were really quite nice. So this is partially SlidesGo, their AI, and the rest of it is my trying to put together something that was prettier than looking at my face for half an hour. So they called it this, and I thought that was a kind of a cute title: The Luminary Legacy, Unveiling Quddus, the Bábi Hero. Okay. So as you heard in the introduction, and that was a lovely song, that was a Cliff Notes version of my presentation. Although we rank Quddus only second in importance to the Bab, we just don't have much in English that is comprehensive and maybe gets into I thought Dawnbreakers was the primary source in English, but when you start looking around, there are multiple sources that are all very early versions of the story of the Bab and the Letters of the Living and the early Bábis, and they don't always agree. So because this was an academic paper originally, I tried to address that. So if I've been told I can make the paper available to anyone who wants to read 150 pages, but I will try to give you the substance of it, and I hope I'm not insulting anybody by giving you everything that you already know, and I hope I'm not confusing people new to the material by giving them stuff they weren't quite ready for. So I will take questions at the end, and hope that this is of value to some of you. So setting the scene, I'm just going to say Quddus. His eventual given name would have been Mullah Muhammad Ali Barfarushi. He was born in the port city of Barfarouche, which was up in the Mazandaran province, not very far from where Baha'u'llah spent a lot of time, in the province of the city of Nur on the Caspian Sea. It because I included this, although it's a short talk, because I think it bears on maybe the viciousness of his eventual martyrdom, which you heard discussed in the song. In Persia, going back a couple of hundred years, there were two civil factions called the Haydari and the Namadi. That when I read about them, that if you encountered the Hatfields and the McCoys in American folklore, it's almost like that. It goes the friction goes back a long way. I don't think anybody actually knows who started it or why, but periodically there are outbreaks of violence between these two groups, and they were very active in Barfarouche in the time when Quddus was a young man. He was born in the eastern area of Barfarouche and what might have been a village, but could have been a quarter called Akarud. And the Namadi on the whole were the less affluent people. So that was his background. His dad was a poor rice farmer. Now, in the same time that the Haydari and the Namadi are kind of fighting and feuding, there were two versions of Islam and Islamic jurisprudence that came along that were called the Usuli, which tended to be like the 1%, the more affluent people, and the Akbari. And the difference between them was the Usuli, in terms of jurisprudence, thought that it was good that people could use the Quran and the Hadith as a basis for jurisprudence, but they could also use logic. To me, that sounds like the more maybe liberal version of Islamic jurisprudence, but they got very, very harsh to the extent of the mujtahids, that the doctors of the law that they would certify would actually, they would sign warrants that were death warrants of the other faction, the Akbari. The Akbari, interestingly enough, largely went with the Sheikhi school. They, their leaders had studied with Sheikh Ahmad, who was, as many of you know, kind of a millennialist within the context of the Islam of the 1800s. Each had a leader. You may have heard of these fellows, the Haydari / Usuli. Their leader was called, a title given to him by the Shah for his persecution of the Bábis, basically. He was called Sayyid al-Ulama. The leader for the Namadis or the Akbaris was called Shariat Madar, and he was Quddus's mentor. Quddus, as a young man, studied with Shariat Madar. And at a very early age, Shariat Madar realized his spiritual capacities. Now, let's see if we can change the slide. It worked, yay. So, okay, this is believed to be a picture of Quddus. I had this verified by a gentleman who studied quite a little bit of Bábi history named Adel Sharif Ford. So I feel fairly confident that this may be what he actually looked like. So that was fun. I've never actually seen a picture of him. Again, born in Barfarouche in the eastern, not particularly affluent area. His mother died young, but we have information that the stepmother, his father's second wife, treated him as if he were her own child. His spiritual capacity was recognized to the point that at the age of 12, he was sent on from Barfarouche to the provincial capital, Sari, for schooling. And shortly after that, he got sent all the way over to Mashhad in Khorasan to study with the Mullah Jafar. At about 18, he went to the Atabad, which is the kind of general term for the shrine cities of what's now Eastern Iraq. And he studied with Sayyid Kazim Urashti. Fellow students, and in at least one of these sites did turn out to be other letters of the living, including Mullah Hussein, Mullah Ali-e Bastami, who's considered to be the first Bábi martyr. And we believe he probably crossed, there was a 7-month period where he and the Bab probably were studying with Sayyid Kazim at the same time, so it's likely they did meet. Like this was a title generated by the AI, but I kind of liked it. He seemed, when you read about him, he seems to have been aware of his destiny and to have embraced it fully. One thing, there's evidence that his father died probably before the Báb declared his mission. There's another thread that has the father being alive toward the end of his life. In the version where only the stepmother is still alive, she said her one hope in life now was to see him married. He's quoted as saying, "The time of my marriage has not yet come. That time will surely come, and it will be very glorious. My marriage celebration will not be at home, but in the green field and under the sky in front of the people. All the inhabitants of the city will be there that day when I will achieve my dream." In another place, he said, "A celebration of joy and success cannot be done briefly. Rather, it should occur in a grand manner and be established in the public's eye with drums and trumpets and general commotion." And those of you who know the story will understand when he's discussing his marriage, he's talking about the reunion with his true beloved God, and he's discussing his martyrdom. In Barfarouche, in the area where he was, there was a madrasa, like a theological college run by a guy named Mirza Zaki, and the school had closed down, so it was now sort of a ruin. So in the context of that, he said a couple of things of interest we'll learn about later. Speaking of the vicissitudes of the world, he said, "This college, for instance, was once frequented and flourishing, and is now desolate and ruined. After a while, some illustrious man will be buried here. Men will come from afar to visit the place, and once again it will flourish." He also said, "The body of a great person whom people do not recognize now will be burnt in this place with rice straw, and though it ignites with life, it will not burn, but people will not cease their wicked acts without concern." Also, he's quoted as saying he was in the bathhouse one afternoon and was, I guess people didn't have fingernail clippers back then. He was clipping his nails with a paring knife and cut himself. And people kind of was like, "Oh my God, you're bleeding." And he said to them, "You who become so sorrowful and affected by seeing this minor wound, how can you bear to see my body torn to pieces and drenched in blood?" And I realize that's a little gruesome, but again, he seems to have anticipated his martyrdom and perhaps even the way, bless me, even the way it would occur. And yet he didn't shirk his responsibilities. He went high-hearted and full of energy to meet his destiny. Excuse me. In Barfarouche, when he returned from the Attabat, excuse me, when he returned from the Attabat and was, managing the family business, there was a dinner party, and the host had invited Quddus and additionally Shariat Madar and Sayyid al-Ulama, the two at this point were bitter rivals, and very much the leaders of their own factions. When they arrived, the host asked Sayyid al-Ulama to explain a point of theology from the Quran, and he got up and said what he had to say. And then the host said, "Well, we have Mullah Shariat Madar here. Let's hear what he has to say." So he got up and he explained it. And then there still seemed to be something missing. So Shariat Madar said, "Well, there's Quddus. Why don't we ask him? He has unusual spiritual insights." And this enraged Sayyid al-Ulama, who is reported to have said, "Before a mullah who has spent many years in study, is it permissible to demand knowledge from a young person who has studied for a short time?" And then in the meanwhile, while he was carping to his host, Quddus was dazzling people with his spiritual insights. So we have kind of multiple things feeding into this rivalry. Quddus studied with Sayyid al-Ulama's vicious rival. and now he's kind of embarrassed him publicly at a dinner party by expanding and extrapolating on all these neat spiritual ideas. I wish we knew what the question was and what he had to say, but this story is reported in numerous sources. So he was making a name for himself when he was still quite young. After he returned to Barfarouche in about the time around Nowruz of 1844, Quddus dreamed of the promised Qaim and set off on foot to perform a Hajj. He and about a number of people who had studied with Sayyid Kazim were probably present when Sayyid Kazim died, and Sayyid Kazim's instructions to them were very, very similar to what the Bab's would be to his Letters of the Living, that the promised one of Islam was alive on the earth right now, and they needed to haste with joyful hearts to find him and become his disciples. A lot of Baha'is know this story, but let me go over it quickly. When Quddus arrived in Shiraz, which was where the Bab lived, who should he encounter but his friends Mullah Hussein and Mullah Ali Bastami? And I think this is wonderful. He encountered Mullah Hussein, but he also noticed the person he believed to be the promised one, the Qaim of Islam. And Mullah Hussein was kind of like, okay, calm down. You know, you're weary from your travels. Let's take a breath here. And Quddus said, he recognized the Bab. He said, why do you seek to hide him from me? I can recognize him by his gait. I mean, imagine that. You can recognize the promised Qaim just by the way he walks. I confidently testify that none besides him, whether in the East or the West, can claim to be the truth. None other can manifest the power and majesty that radiate from his holy person. But Mullah Hussein still got him to calm down for a second, went to the Bab and said, there's somebody here who'd like to see you. So the Bab replied, marvel not at his strange behavior. We now pay close attention to this sentence. We have in the world of the spirit been communing with that youth. We know him already. We indeed awaited his coming. Go to him and summon him forthwith to our presence. And I think this will bear on the relationship that the Bab and Quddus had later, a little bit later in life. We don't have, in religious history that I know of, we don't really have another instance of the revelator being incarcerated and kept away from his followers for an extended period of time. And we know this is going to happen to the Bab. So I would invite you to mull over, is the fact that they'd been communing already in the world of the spirit something that allowed Quddus to be a leader for the Bábi community when the Bab was incarcerated in Azerbaijan. Quddus was on his way to the Hajj, and so was the Bab. Of all the Letters of the Living, they had been identified at this point. Instead of, you might think he wanted to take Mullah Hussein, who was his first believer, but he chose to take Quddus. They had I guess the way you got on pilgrimage in 1844 was different than now. They had to take a long, long sea voyage from the port city of Bashuri in what's now Iran around the Arabian Peninsula onto the port city of Jeddah, which was quite, I guess it looks like it's up to 2 months. It's reported as different lengths. The sea voyage was so hard on the Bab that later he, when he was prescribing pilgrimage for his followers, he actually exempted you. If the only way you could get to your pilgrimage sites was by sea, you didn't have to go. The sea voyage was that rough. He spent most of it just dictating tablets to Quddus. Quddus became his amanuensis for that voyage. So they're spending a lot of time, probably between 9 and 12 months in intimate communication, very close together. Quddus understands the thoughts and feelings and the magnitude of the revelation of the Bab because he's been taking dictation essentially for all of this voyage and all the time that they're in the pilgrimage cities of Mecca and Medina. I popped up in case none of you were unfamiliar with what the pilgrimage site for Muslims looks like. This is the Kaaba in the center of the city of Mecca. It is an ancient building believed to have been built by Abraham. Um, when the Bab was on pilgrimage, once the pilgrimage rites, which last a number of days, were over, he fulfilled some prophecies about the Qaim by grabbing kind of the doorknob to the door that leads into the interior of the Kaaba, leaning his back on the Kaaba and saying, I am the promised one. And there wasn't an immediate rush to become followers by the people there, but this was an unusually large pilgrimage. It was a special year. So people from all over the Muslim world were there. And at the time he made this announcement, people were crowding the square and on rooftops. And so many people heard this announcement. So even if they didn't rush to, say, where do I sign up? This was something that quickly, the idea spread throughout the Muslim world because of his announcement at this pilgrimage. And Quddus was with him. Quddus took a special letter to the Sharif of Mecca saying, I'm the Qaim, please come follow me. And they spent quite a number of months together on this journey. When they returned, the Bab said that this was the last meeting they would have in this life and that they would both drink from the cup of martyrdom and they would not see each other again until both had been martyred. So kind of a poignant separation. The first thing that the Bab did was write a letter and send it with Quddus to his uncle in Shiraz. The uncle that had raised him thought highly of his nephew, but had not yet really been informed about the nature of his mission. So it was Quddus who was able to take the letter and then explain to the greater uncle what the nature of his nephew's mission was. And at that point, the uncle became a very devoted follower of the Bab and eventually became one of the 7 martyrs of Tehran. He had other things that he was supposed to do, had letters to take to other people, but the Bab said he would, in Shiraz, he would first encounter persecution. And indeed, the Bab had written a document that included about 7 mostly personal observation type laws. So the early Babis there was like a special ring that they had and a special verse that they put in an amulet. One of the things that he said that was not part of just personal praxis was, many of you probably know that there's a call to prayer that the Muslims have 5 times a day. He wanted a verse added to the call to prayer, and one of the new Babis in Shiraz, who had a following, went to the mosque where he practiced with his followers, and without too much warning, used this new form of the azan, which caused a hubbub. And it resulted in this believer and Shiraz and possibly 1 or 2 others being arrested. They were, let's see, their beards and mustaches were burned off, and they had, I realize nose piercing is kind of a fun fashion thing these days, but not because they wanted to. Their noses, the septum of their noses, I guess, was pierced and a thong was passed through, and they were paraded around the city with that in that condition. And I guess the executioners back then, part of their salary came from marching prisoners around the city and displaying them, and people would throw money at them. So this is what happened to them. The oldest fellow in the party, Quddus, who I believe became a hand of the cause when Baha'u'llah proclaimed his mission, despite his age, was sentenced to a number of lashes, which he did survive. There are instances where it's reported he said he actually had to do this, put his hand over his mouth while they were lashing him, because he said after about the 7th lash, he just didn't feel anything. And he didn't really want the executioners to know that he wasn't feeling the stroke of the lash. So anyway, they were tortured and cast out of the city, and Quddus then went on his way. Everywhere he went, he inspired people. He eventually comes to Tehran, where he is invited into the household of Baha'u'llah. And this is what Mirza Musa Akai Kalim, Baha'u'llah's faithful brother, described him this way: the charm of his person, his extreme affability, combined with the dignity of bearing, appealed to even the most careless observer. Whoever was intimately associated with him was seized with an insatiable admiration for the charm of that youth. We watched him one day perform his ablutions and were struck by the gracefulness which distinguished him from the rest of the worshippers in the performance of so ordinary a rite. He seemed in our eyes to be the very incarnation of purity and grace. And on that occasion, he met Abdu'l-Baha, who was a whopping 2 years old. And on this occasion, he named Abdu'l-Baha the Mystery of God, which was the name that Baha'u'llah would eventually give him when Abdu'l-Baha had grown to manhood. So this may be a measure of Quddus's spiritual insight, that he actually picked the title Baha'u'llah would eventually give Abdu'l-Baha. Meanwhile, I found this is a very pretty shot of probably a pretty desolate place. This is the fortress of Maku in western Azerbaijan, where the Bab had been incarcerated during this period. While he was incarcerated, Mullah Hussein made a visit to him. And among other things, the Bab said, when you go on your way, make sure you stop in Barfarouche, because there you will find a hidden treasure. So coming to Barfarouche, Mullah Hussein, of course, stopped in to visit his friend Quddus. Quddus, welcomed him with open arms, gave him precedence. When the Bábis and Barfarouche met, Mullah Hussein had like the seat of honor. After the rest of the Bábis had gone in their way and they were bedding down for the night, Quddus said, "Do you have any new writings from the Bab?" And Mullah Hussein said, I'm sorry, I don't." At which point Quddus pulled out a scroll and handed it to Mullah Hussein and kind of said, "Here, read this." Mullah Hussein read that, and his world apparently was revolutionized. He said, "I can well realize that the author of these words has drawn his inspiration from that fountainhead which stands immeasurably superior to the sources whence the learning of men is ordinarily derived. I hereby testify to my wholehearted recognition of the sublimity of these words and to my unquestioned acceptance of the truth which they reveal. The hidden treasure of which the Bab has spoken now lies unveiled before my eyes. Its light has dispelled the gloom of perplexity and doubt. Though my master be now hidden amid the mountain fastnesses of Azerbaijan, the sign of his splendor and the revelation of his might stand manifest before me. I have found in the Mazandaran the reflection of his glory." And of course, Quddus was the person who had written the scroll. So the next night when the Bábis came, Mullah Hussein was so overcome by this belief that I hesitate to use the word channeling because that's kind of new age, but he believes that Quddus is actually conveying the sense of the teachings of their common master, the Bab. And he understands that Quddus's place, even though Mullah Hussein was the first leader of the living, he understands that Quddus's station is much higher than his own. One of the things that Quddus asked Mullah Hussein to do was go to the province of Khorasan and establish a Bahá'í or a Bábi teaching center there, which he did, and Quddus eventually joined him. I found a little picture of the place that was built for them was called the Babia, and it was in Mashhad. And it became like, I guess now we would have Baha'i centers, so I guess it became a Bábi center. The message was sweeping the country at this point. There were whole villages that would embrace the cause of the Bab when teachers came and said the Qaim has arisen. So they had great success in Mashhad. It also almost sounds like they worked as kind of like a tag team where Mullah Hussein would go out and spread the word that the Qaim had arrived. And then he would take the people to Quddus, who would then expand the truths of the Bábi revelation. This happened at a time when Khorasan province was kind of in the middle of a civil war. So because so many people were becoming interested in the Bab's message, this provoked the civil authorities, and there were persecutions there. In fact, Mullah Hussein was invited by the local regiment that was kind of in residence a few miles west of the town to just be their guest for a few days, which he did. And Quddus left because the hubbub was becoming, dangerous for the new Babis. While he was on the road from Khorasan, who should he encounter but Baha'u'llah and a number of other Babis? And in the hamlet of Badasht, there was a conference that this is a kind of a defining moment for the Bábi revelation. Not all of the early Babis understood that this was a new revelation. Many of them thought, and the Bab let them think for a while, many of them thought this was just kind of a revolutionary millenarian offshoot of Islam. Just as they were still Muslims, this was just a different interpretation of the teachings. At the conference of Badasht, this idea was completely scrapped, and it became very clear that this was not just a sect of Islam. This was a brand new revelation, and the promised one of Islam, the Qaim, was its originator. Many Baha'is know the story. There was a great Bábi woman named Tahireh, who was one of the Letters of the Living. And although this conference was meant to be a reevaluation of the attitude of the Babis toward Islam and the relationship to it, they weren't necessarily still getting the idea that this was an independent revelation. So to drive home the point, Tahireh, greatly respected, a beautiful woman, a great poet, showed up one day without her veil. Most of the rest of the attendees at this conference were men. Many of them just went, I guess, ballistic. It's like, oh my God, this is like the reincarnation of Fatimeh. And like they thought it was irreverent to even look at her shadow. They held her in such reverence. And she appeared and said, I am the word that the Qaim will utter. And I've only ever found one scholar who disagreed with this interpretation, and Abdul Baha doesn't confirm this interpretation. It's believed this was something that was pre-planned, I guess, by Baha'u'llah, Quddus, and Tahireh, that she would appear as the voice that would say, yeah, this is a new revelation. You need to understand that we are abrogating some of the laws of Islam, and we have the right to do that because the Qaim has appeared and I guess said so. Quddus would take the part of the person that was kind of maintaining the status quo, and over the course of probably a number of days, this allowed the Babis to hash out what their relationship was to Islam. What is the Bábi faith? If the Qaim is here, is the second eschatological figure, the Qaim, is he coming? So it let them stop and take a breath and ask questions that would need to be answered and that people would be asking. What is our relationship to Islam? How long will this revelation last? So the road to Badasht, we may have people that weren't quite sure if they were an independent faith yet. The road from Badasht, everybody that stayed and hashed out these questions now were confirmed in their faith and knew that this was indeed an independent revelation and that the time of the promised one of Islam had arrived. After the conference of Badasht, Quddus went on his way. The party, which was most of the Babis from the Badasht conference, was waylaid at a village called Niala. And the violence was of such a degree that Baha'u'llah actually gave Quddus his own clothing and said, let's make you as incognito as we can, and go on your way. Let's keep you safe. So they were waylaid there, but also on his way back to Barfarouche, Quddus was captured by the pretty much the partisans of Sayyid al-Ulama, and he was taken to Sari, where he had studied as a young man, and kept under house arrest for quite a few months. His jailer, or his host, I guess, Mirza Muhammad Taqi, had at one point asked him, they debated, this guy never became a Bábi, and indeed may have been hostile to the faith later in his life. But as of when Quddus was his guest, he asked Quddus a number of deep theological questions. And one of Quddus's major and largest body of work came from this. He was asked, there's a surah in the Quran, very, very late, so very, very short, just about the nature of the oneness of God. And Muhammad Taqi asked him not to write even on that subject, but on the word Samad, just the letter S. And from just this one question, Quddus managed to generate a work that is said to be 3 times the length of the Quran. He completed it at the fort of Sheikh Tabarsi, at which point it was supposed to be 6 to 7 times the length of the Quran. So even though he's under house arrest, even though he's kind of out of circulation from the generality of the Babis, he keeps working, and nothing is quenching the fire of his enthusiasm. I'm sorry, I need just a second. This is a hard incident for me to talk about. Quddus, while he was in prison in Sari, the Bab was able to get a message to Mullah Hussein saying, raise the black standards, which are one of the traditions of Islam. That means the Qayyim has arrived, as his armies will march under a black standard, which was the standard of Muhammad. When Mullah Hussein complied and rounded up several hundred Babis to go to Quddus's rescue, he told them they were going to meet their Karbala, and anybody who wasn't ready to do that needed not to come with them. For those of you who don't know, Karbala is kind of the defining moment in Shia Islam. It's the time when the third Imam, the Imam Hussein, was invited with a small party of his family and retainers and some soldiers to rule an area called Kufa. When they were on the march, the Kufans kind of reneged and not only decided they didn't want the Imam Hussein to come leave them, they decided to send 4,000 troops after them to kill them. Many scholars of Islam believe that the Imam Hussein and his party knew this, and they continued their march anyway, knowing that they were going to be outnumbered by like 400%, I think that works out to. They knew that they were going to be martyred then. They went anyway. So this is kind of what Mullah Hussein was telling the Babis that went with him, is the Babis are marching to their Karbala. They built a fort around a little shrine to a saint named Sheikh Ahmad Itabarsi, and withstood a siege of about 6 months. Toward the end, they were down to maybe a sip of water and a couple of grains of rice a day for 18 days. They survived on that, yet every time they were attacked and they were called to defend their station, they pulled it together. And this was a force of possibly 500 to 600 total against the combined armies of the Shah and a number of his princes that had their own armies. I found this picture that I thought was kind of fun. At one point, Mullah Hussein knows he's going to be martyred, and he has the Babis dig a well, and some people also say a bathhouse, so that they could do their ablutions and purify themselves. And then he invited, on one of the sorties that they had from the fort, he invited anybody who was ready for martyrdom that day. to do their ablutions at this well and purify themselves. And I found a shot of the well that at least as late as the 1960s, it was still producing water. So I included that as a kind of a historical fun fact. Toward the end, when their opponents knew that they were starving and kind of running out of water, at one point they kind of said, let's just stop fighting. They're starving, they're going to capitulate. We just need to wait a few more days. They never did. So the Shah's forces had to resort to like the worst kind of chicanery. Their leader took a copy of the Quran and wrote in it a pledge that if the Bábis left the fort, he would make sure they were safe and he would see them on their way so that they could return to their homes. Oh, okay. And I understand I'm kind of running out of time. The Bábis, including Quddus, really didn't believe he meant this. But the Quddus said, because he's taken the Quran as witness, I guess we should probably agree. So they did leave, and of course, this was a ruse. They were marched off, and many of them were killed, many of them with an unusual degree of violence. And this episode has always, I realized that the Shah was getting kind of like, we need to end this now. You guys go do something with the Bábis, or we're going to execute you and you'll lose your position in your lands. But the fact that they would take the Quran and write in it a pledge they didn't mean to keep. This is the cartoon is a shot from C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, wherein one of the characters calls on a god he doesn't truly believe in, and then the god actually shows up. So it seemed like that kind of thing. I would worry about my eventual dispensation in the afterlife if I did that. Of course, Quddus, because of the specific enmity of Sayyid al-Ulama, was singled out for specific, a specifically cruel martyrdom. Quddus was actually protected by one of the princes that was in charge of these regiments, because the prince wanted to hand Quddus over to the Shah personally. And he eventually got talked out of it. And many things about Quddus's passion would remind you of the Passion of Jesus, if you're at all familiar with that story. One of them is when this guy finally capitulates and hands Quddus over to Sayyid al-Ulama. He says specifically, just like Pontius Pilate, I now wash my hands of this man's fate. So kind of a curious thing. I don't know if we got to that at the beginning, but when Quddus was being essentially tortured to death, he didn't cry out for help. He just basically said what Jesus did on the cross: Father, forgive them. They don't know. So there actually turn out to be two versions of the martyrdom. One is that many are familiar with from Dawnbreakers. He was essentially just thrown to the crowd. But the other is that Sayyid al-Ulama killed himself. He had an iron axe, which when Quddus was handed over to him, he lopped off, I think, his ears and his nose, and then flipped him in the head with the axe, and that ended his life. And after that, he was thrown to the mob. So one way or the other, he was thrown to the mob. There are very interesting accounts that when Sayyid al-Ulama saw the heights of the violence that was done to Quddus's body, he tried to have the body, or at least pieces of it, collected and burned, and it would not. And that may be a little fanciful, but if you remember Quddus's prediction that he would be burned with rice stalks, and the rice stalks would burn, but the body wasn't. His friend Shariat Madar was able to collect the pieces of the body, and he was interred in this old madrasa, exactly where he said he would be. Let me get to just these two more slides, because here's the theological stuff. So who, where, or what was Quddus? We often try to explain the difference between, say, a manifestation of God or a prophet and a regular human, saying, our souls are like mirrors, and if we polish them beautifully, we can reflect the light of God. And a revelator just has a perfect mirror that perfectly reflects the light of God. I wonder if a different version would be more applicable. So I came up with this graphic. I think to the right, you see this is backwards. A prism breaks up light, it does not condense it. But for the sake of the metaphor, what if we looked at the revelator kind of like this prism, and the revelator takes all this abundant knowledge of God that would burn a normal person to a cinder if he was exposed to it, condenses it down and delivers it to man, and then man is like the mirror, and Quddus would have been like on the left side where C is. That's a bunch of little mirrors with different amounts of dross on them and reflecting the light differently. What if we said Quddus was this big, beautiful, absolutely perfect mirror in which the light of the Báb could be seen when the Báb was taken away from his followers? And if you would like to read the paper, I have some information on Quddus's writings, and if you can read Persian, the book Hidden Treasure does have what we have of his writings in Farsi. Okay, but this is my last slide. Just take a second to consider this. This is a statement of Quddus. We are the true sovereign, and the world is under our seal, and the kings of the earth will be humble before us and in accordance with the divine word. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Nearness to us is only through righteousness, and we do not respect anyone for their wealth and worldly status, nor do we despise anyone for their poverty and destitution. Now look at what he's saying. He is speaking with the royal we, with the voice of God that is normally vested only to the revelators. Only the Báb and Baha'u'llah normally speak with this voice. Why can he do this? In the front of the book, The Dawnbreakers, we see images of all the different tablets that the Báb wrote for each of the letters of the living. And in the one that he wrote for Quddus, it says, "This book contains verses from myself unto the letter Tha," meaning Quddus, "to the end that all may bear witness that he, Quddus, is my servant. I, meeting the Báb, divulged my glory unto him through mine own logos self, for there is no deity except I myself, God, the help in peril, the self-subsisting. I did cast into his inmost heart such expository verses as, I Quddus, indeed, am God, the ruler, almighty. I indeed am God. No God is there except I myself." So we have Quddus, with the Báb's permission, speaking with this voice of God that is normally only vested in the revelator. So not a manifestation, but perhaps someone who so perfectly reflected the Báb's light that the Báb was able to vest him with this ability to speak with the voice of God. It's a conjecture, but I offer it to you as something to think about. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. That was really moving, an amazing presentation. Thank you. So if people have questions, you can put it in the chat. We already have some. Okay, the first one is, I thought Tahirih was all the letters combined in spiritual greatness. Can you comment, please?
Oh my. I can refer you to somebody who can. There's another graduate student at the Graduate Theological Seminary who's doing her paper, her thesis on Tahirih. I'm sorry, I kind of went full Quddus immersion. And that's a little bit beyond my ability to address, and I apologize for that. But I could put you in touch with the young lady who's doing her thesis on Tahirih.
The next question is, have you seen the tablet of visitation of Quddus?
The one that the Báb, there are a couple of them because several were written for him and Mullah Hussein, and at least one was written for him personally. And I do have comments on it in the body of my paper. It's available. Let me think where I found it. It was in a Persian source that I had to get translated. But yeah, I have seen it, and if you want to, actually, I have my email on that last slide. If you'd like to email me your information, I can send you the information that I found about it.
Great. And people are asking how they can get a copy of your thesis. They can also.
I guess I have to ask you that. I
Yeah.
understand Bayan, I think, said it could be posted on the YouTube page.
Yeah, when we post this video on YouTube, we'll link it in the description. So that's how you can get it. And you can,
Okay.
I'll put the link to our YouTube channel again in chat.
And warning, it is 150 typed pages, but I would not feel offended if you did not read it. But I would be delighted if you did and if you commented.
The next question is, why is he the moon of the Bábi revelation?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. That is a title Abdu'l-Bahá gave him. Hang on a second. I was hoping somebody would do the messengers charged with imposture. Hang on, scrolling. There we go, Moon of Guidance. Okay. Can I read you the text of Abdu'l-Bahá that he refers to it?
Yes, please go for it.
Okay, this is from some answered questions, section 13, and he's largely quoting Revelation. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven, meaning that from the invisible heaven they heard the voice of God saying, you have performed all that was proper and fitting in delivering the teachings and glad tidings. You have given my message to the people and raised the call of God and have accomplished your duty. Now, like Christ, you must sacrifice your life for the well-beloved and be martyrs. And the Son of Reality and that moon of guidance, both like Christ, set on the horizon of the greatest martyrdom and ascended to the kingdom of God. And Abdu'l-Bahá explains that the Son of Reality in that last sentence is the Báb, and the moon of guidance is Quddús. That is that I can't see who asked the question. Can you say yes, that suffices, or were you looking for something else?
You can ask us a follow-up question if you want, or give a thumbs up. Or
this is I like Zoom, but it's a hard way to relate to your audience because you can't see them.
Well, there's a follow-up question from her. What else does it imply?
What else does it imply? Well, I wondered if it was a little bit like this little graphic that I made up. The sun. I don't know if any of you have ever been in a place where there's no ambient light and been under a full moon. Surprisingly, a full moon with no other like light interference is bright enough to cast shadows, just like the sun. I was looking at it pretty much in the same way, that if the Báb is like the Son of Reality, casting the brightest light, Quddús, as a perfect mirror, would reflect that light to the extent that it could also produce the same effect with luminous. Does that? I hope that's good.
It makes sense to me. Thank you. What is the source that says the Sayyid Ulama hacked off the Báb's nose and ears?
Let me look. I think it was the Tariq-i-Jadid, which is quoted, and not as much as Nicholas, but is quoted quite a bit in Dawnbreakers. And I can take a peek at that. Yeah, what I have is the reference for the part that I quoted was the Tariq-i-Jadid, which is The author is a fellow named Hamadani, and this is available online. It was translated by Edward Granville Brown, and if you put in Tariq-i Jadid English, it comes up pretty easily, and it's not nearly the length of Dawnbreakers. But I have seen that there's a certain amount of interborrowing with the early sources. I've seen that in more than one place, but the Tariq-i Jadid, and I hope I'm saying that right, is where I found it. If anybody's read The Handmaid's Tale, they executed political criminals by something called, I think Margaret Atwood made up the word, but particution. So the crowd tore them to pieces. So we know that Baha'u'llah, it's not extremely clear in Dawnbreakers exactly at what point Quddus died. But the idea that he was thrown to the crowd and the women of low birth took their knives and cut him up. In one version, he must still be alive because he prayed that his tormentors would be forgiven. So one of the kind of interesting things about the different early sources is there are what I would call sacred history has started to intrude even with these events not that far in the past. Like we know there were probably eventually 500 to 600 Bábis at the fort of Sheikh Tabarsi. However, there are sources that say Mullah Hussein would be martyred with 70 good men. 70 or 72 is the traditional number of warriors that were also martyred with the Imam Hussein. So in reading some of these early histories, you need to be maybe a little bit aware of where reference perhaps is being made to important events in Shia Islam. If you are doing your own study, I would learn from my fail when I was trying to reconcile these different sources. I think that's what's going on with a lot of them.
The next question is, am I correct that there was a shrine of Quddus which has been destroyed by the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Yeah, the place there's a picture of this madrasa online where he was where Shariat Madar got what was left of him interred, and it was desecrated. And I'm sorry, I have the date in the paper. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I think it was the 1980s, but yeah, it was his grave.
There's a question, what town in Utah are you in?
Oh, it's called Centerville. It's a northern suburb of Salt Lake City. And if anyone, you know how the House is saying we should homefront pioneer. We would love to have homefront pioneers or youths doing a year of service would be of great service in our area. So let me put that out there.
Any other questions?
And I apologize for the length of that. I was trying to keep it to 30 to 45 minutes.
No, that's good. It's perfect. Thank you.
So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your talk. Thank you everyone for your questions. And yeah, like I mentioned, this will be available on our YouTube channel and the link is in the chat if you're not subscribed already, and we'll link your thesis to that video as well. So these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time. So we'll see you all next week. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye.